and we moved to Denver, Colorado, and then from there to Texas. I've already moved, I think, 13 times total, right? Y'all keep us in your prayers because we're looking at houses around here, so we may end up making that 14. So anyway, serial movers may not be able to stay in one place very long. But of course, when we go and we find a different place to live or maybe relocate, we always want to consider our relationship with God, and we always want to worship Him. I appreciate this thought about Abraham as we study his life. I'm going to be using the term Abram, Abraham interchangeably. Recognize God changes his name in Genesis 17, which is about halfway through our narrative of what we're looking at. But here's a couple of truths that we can get with regard to Abraham's life just right at the outset. Number one, geographically, we can track Abraham by the places he goes. And that's what we intend to do this evening, at least in part. That's why I said the handout may be helpful to you because it gives all the major events of Abraham's life, and that way you can get some key points of where he moved and how often he moved. Spiritually, however, we can also track Abraham by the altars he builds. Abraham, as he gets into the promised land, builds a number of altars, and there are different points in his life, it seems like, for the purpose of honoring God at different points in his life. That's an important point, and again, we'll capitalize on that as we go through these journeys geographically. However, what I want you to also understand is spiritually also, God's promises sustain him and encourage him all along the way. I've given those to you on the handout over there on the right side of the page, and those little bubbles that are colored in. What I would do, if you're a person that likes to write in your Bible, take a highlighter or something like that and draw brackets around them or highlight those passages, because it's interesting to me that every time Abraham moves, there's also a new promise of God or a reassurance of a promise that God has already made that Abraham gets to listen to and gets to have to reinforce him and encourage him as he moves along the way. All right? Those three truths are important. And let's get started this evening by opening up our Bibles to Genesis chapter 11, Genesis chapter 12, and we will begin to chart his moves geographically. We're going to start off with the call of Abraham in Genesis 11, Genesis 12. God called to Abram, and it says there in verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 1, "Now the Lord had said to Abram." This is something that God had said already in the past that now affects what Abram's doing in the present. When we catch up with him here at Genesis chapter 12, note where he is. Verse 31 of previous chapter. Look at chapter 11, verse 31. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, and the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and Abraham's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, and then they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. We already have a couple of places. What are they? They're on the screen. We've got Ur of Chaldees, and we've got Haran. All right? Take your pen on the back of your paper there, and consider, we're going to start down here in the lower right-hand corner at Ur. Okay? You can go ahead and label that. That's where Ur is, down there next to the Persian Gulf. What's that? I forgot my pointer again. It's up in my office, I'm sorry. The pointer, down in the very corner where it says, God called Abram. Here's my pointer. God called Abram out of Ur. Thank you. I don't know who that is. Oh, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that. There's Ur down there in the bottom right-hand corner. Once again, Abram's going ultimately to the promised land. What route is he going to follow? He's going to follow the Fertile Crescent. Why is that? Is he alone when he makes this journey? He's not. He's got wealth beyond imagination already, leaving out of Ur of Chaldees. By the way, Ur of Chaldees is the place where you see this ziggurat, this temple. Just found out, heard a news story not too long ago that said that they're restoring this and they're making it more accessible to tourists. Some of the bricks and things like that are crumbling, but a ziggurat is a tower of types. You know, you think about the Tower of Babel. That's maybe what this began with, or something like it, and that's the idea. Once again, Abram's following the Fertile Crescent here. We're going to take our pen, we're going to go from and we're going to go all the way up to Haran, chapter 12, verses 1 and 4. So he starts out, and we go all the way up, following between perhaps the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates River, that's those two blue lines, up here to this next dot, which is Marai, and then up on into Haran. Those of you that notice the scale of miles, this is a scale of 200 miles. How far have we gone thus far? Roughly. 600 to 800-ish. That's a pretty good guess. How old is Abram when we catch up to him here in Genesis chapter 12? Anybody remember? 75. He is 75 years old. And he's very, very wealthy. He's got family back here in and now he's taking this journey all the way up north to Haran, where his father Terah dies. And remember that Abram's not done with this journey, right? Abram's not done with this journey because God tells Abram to leave from Haran, chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I'm going to show you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I'll make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curses you. And in your name, and you, rather, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So now what Abram's doing is he's going to take this journey from Haran and go all the way down into the promised land. If we're charting this, we're going to go all the way through here. You want to label Damascus along the way, that'd be just fine. The first place he comes to in the promised land, you go to this cutout here over to the left, please, Thomas. The little cutout where it says Shechem up at the top. He comes into the land of Israel, and he's there at Shechem. He's there at Shechem. Genesis chapter 12, verses 7 and 8. The Lord appeared to Abram, said, to your descendants I give this land, and he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. You look back up at verse 6 of the same chapter. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth trees of Moreh, and the Canaanites were there in the land. As he comes in, one of the very first things that he does is he builds an altar to God. He builds an altar to God. Here at Shechem, he's going to build, if we will, an altar of promise. Here's what God is saying. Abram, I've now brought you to this land that you've never seen before. I brought you to this land flowing with milk and honey that your descendants are going to inherit, and to your descendants I'm going to give this land. And there Abram built this altar, an altar of promise, because God says, this is your land. This is what I'm giving you. All right? As he builds that altar there at Shechem, and that's the little stone thing that I've got underneath the word Shechem. From there, look at verse 8. He moved from there to the mountains east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Here's Abram taking his journey. He's now going to go south from Shechem down here between Bethel and Ai. Sorry, I went too far. It's the very first dot. All right? And he's camping on the east side between Bethel and Ai. And what does he do there in verse 8? He builds an altar. That's exactly right. As he builds this altar, here is now an altar of praise, if you will. Bethel, which Jacob is later going to name, we refer to it as Bethel just because we understand where that place is. What does the word Bethel mean? I see the L on the end, which is the name for who? God. Beth, house of God. It's where Jacob saw the Jacob's ladder that the angels were ascending and descending, and Jesus would make reference to that there in John chapter 1. It's an altar of praise because now he has an honor and a opportunity to honor his God here in this land. All right? Where does he go after this? Look at verse 9, Genesis 12. He goes on still towards the New King James just says south. Okay? It's the biblical word Negev, as some of you have said, which is basically just saying it's the southland. So he builds this altar here at Bethel, and he keeps on going south. We're going to pick up back on our big map, down here, way down to the Negev, to the southlands. Notice what he's seen already. This is the land that his people are going to inherit. How much of it has he seen? Basically, the majority of it, right? He hadn't seen necessarily over there on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, but the primary, the big part of the land, he's already now journeyed already from north to south. By the way, how far is it from north to south? About 150 miles from St. Louis to... I've already had 2 people mention Corning, Arkansas this evening. Anyway, I'm glad the illustration stuck, right? I guess that's what I want to say. As Abram goes, he goes to this big biblical Negev. This is the southlands. If you want to think about the last little vestiges of greenness going on into the desert down south of there, the Sinai Peninsula, that's kind of the idea. We went to campaign, and my family flew into Albuquerque before we went over to the Navajo Nation on the border of New Mexico and Arizona. And as we were driving out of Albuquerque, it's kind of what I imagined of the Negev, that you've got kind of this green little lush place where Albuquerque is, but then as you get going out into the desert, it's just all desert. That's the idea of the biblical Negev. It's the southlands where it kind of levels out into the plains and then becomes desert a little bit later on. All right? He's 75 years old. Now he's journeying camped in the entirety of the land. Where does he continue down to? He goes to Egypt. Why is that? Because there is a famine in the land. And he takes his journey from the Negev. No doubt he uses that coastal highway that we talked about, and he goes on into Egypt. 90% of Egypt is all right here on what they call the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta. It's where it makes that little triangle up there on to south of the Sea of Mediterranean Sea, rather, and then it goes down on the Nile, even though the Nile flows from south to north. Okay? But 90% of Egypt all lives right there just because, well, I mean, the rest of it's desert. It's just where the water is. He's there. Question. Did God tell Abram to go to Egypt? We don't have a record of that. Best we can say is it's unclear, right? Maybe no. What does Abram do whenever he gets down there? All right. Sarai has got to be a looker even in her older age. Because Abram already knows, and he says, Pharaoh's going to see you, and he's going to kill me, and he's going to take you for his wife. So, why don't you say that you're my sister? That's a half-truth because she was his half-sister, right? Doesn't work out well. Did God tell him to lie? No, he didn't. However, the question we ask is, did God protect his promise that of Abraham he was going to make a great nation? The answer is yes. Look down at verse 17. Verse 17, the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Here's God protecting the sanctity of his promise. And Pharaoh called Abram, said, what is this you've done? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's your sister, that I might take her to my wife? Now therefore, here's your wife. Go and take her and go your way. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him. They sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And then, what did Abram do beginning in chapter 13? Right? Here's a picture, by the way, satellite of the Nile Delta. Again, you see that everything down south of that is going to be all just desert except for that little green spot that follows the Nile River all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. Where does he go from there? Verse 13, chapter 13, verse 1. Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot to the... All right, we're recharting our course. Now we're going from Egypt back up to the southlands, the Negev. All right. Abram was very rich in gold and livestock and silver. Trouble brewing here. He went on his journey as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. So, as he comes back into the land, he's going to return all the way back up to where he built that altar at the first. By the way, anybody keeping up with our scale, how far he's traveled? All right, hold fast just for a second, Phil. I'm looking at maybe 1,200 to 1,500 miles. Does that look about right? You can measure me and tell me how much I'm wrong if you'd like, but that's what it looks like to me just on the surface level. Here's a guy at least 75 years old with all of his things, with all of his family, with his wife and with his nephew and everything, and they are making this journey of about 1,500 miles as far as we've charted, and we're only 2 chapters in. Yes, sir? That's a great question. Phil says he's got to be taking out everything he has. Part of the reason why we know that is because there's a famine in the land. If he can't eat, what can he eat otherwise? Anything else. He's taking all this with him. I can't imagine how long it's taking. A journey of weeks, if not months. Maybe years. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, we just left from there now. We're going back up in there. Again, that's the idea. He goes back to the place where he was at the first time, and it says that he went to the place of the first altar which he'd made, and Abram called on the name of the Lord. So here he's worshiping at this altar that's seemingly already there. And if you want to talk about this in terms of that, what did he not build when he was down in Egypt? He didn't build any altars. But now that he's back up here in the land that God promised him, what does he do? Well, he worships at an altar. And you can talk about this in terms of an altar of protection or safe passage. God's protecting his promise, obviously, from what we saw with Sarai and plaguing Pharaoh's house. You're going to find that again with a king later on as he moves to Gerar. But that's the idea. All right? Everybody following thus far? Okay. There's a problem. Abram and Lot are both super wealthy. In fact, it says there in verse 7, there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites, the Perizzites dwelt in the land. Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from you. If you take the left, then I'll go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. Notice this phrase, verse 10. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw. What was he looking at? He's looking at the land. What specific land? He's looking at the plain of the Jordan where chief city, Sodom. Another chief city, Gomorrah. He's looking, most likely, as scholars would tell us, down here all the way down at the base of the Dead Sea. Thomas, can you see where I'm circling? The plain of the Jordan seemed like it was down there at the base of the Dead Sea, that it was very, very fertile at one time, up until the time that God rained fire and brimstone on it and turned it into kind of a salt flats, as it were. Okay? Lot lifted his eyes. Lot considers the plain of the Jordan, described there in verses 10 and 11. He saw that it was well watered everywhere. This was before, as the writer gives us, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, but it was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as he go towards Zoar. Lot chose for himself all the plain east of the Jordan. Lot journeyed east and separated from there. What's the direction that Lot goes from Bethel here? Go east, young man, right? He goes east, and I'm using the blue, and he goes across the Jordan, and he comes down, presumably down here to the plain of Jordan. Nobody's ever been able to definitively find out where Sodom is, but that's a best guess that a lot of scholars have. All right? So Lot is gone. And the writer gives us, verse 13, the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. But notice verse 14. Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, what does he tell him to do? What does he say there in the middle of verse 14? Lot had separated from him. Now what's the next phrase? Lift up your eyes. Lot had first choice, but now God is telling Abram, you lift up your eyes. Everything that light touches is your king. No. Look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise and walk through the land, its length and its width, for I give it to you. Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there, what did he do? He built an altar to the Lord. From the time that Abram says, Lot, you take your pick. Now God is saying, Abram, you see this? I'm assuring you, you don't have to worry about all those things, but instead understand that I'm going to give you this entirety of the land. Abram then moves from Bethel down here to Jerusalem, down here to Hebron. Down here to Hebron. All right. Here's an altar that he builds, and we can call it an altar of peace. I can't imagine conflict is very easy, especially when you're talking about multitudes of servants, multitudes of herdsmen, multitudes of herds to have to require multitudes of herdsmen. But as Lot goes and departs, and you appreciate Abram for the fact that he yielded, and he yielded first choice to his nephew so that his nephew wouldn't have anything bad to say about him. Now, Abram has departed, and God has said, Abram, don't feel uncertain about this. Abram, don't worry about this, because everything that you're going to see, or everything that you see, is going to belong to your descendants, because that's exactly what I promised. All right? Once again, not making mention of these promise trackers, but notice them as they go along, because they're all right there in the middle of all these things that that God is promising and making sure that He's doing those things. Good. Any questions, thoughts? All right, Abram moves to Hebron. And now we have something that is going to be extraneous. If you like, this was a PowerPoint that I did a while back, and it's used old maps, but just relax just for a minute because I'm going to describe the events of Genesis chapter 14. So Lot's living down here in the cities of the plain, way down south, all right, where I circled Pentapolis. Thomas, work your magic. He's down here in the Pentapolis. Sodom and Gomorrah, most likely, is where they are. They are paying tithes to kings of the north. Right? There's kings that live way up here. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also called Zoar. These 5 cities down here were referred to the cities of the plain. There's a king that's pretty much in charge of this confederacy up here in the north called Chedorlaomer. He's an Elamite. And with the other 3 of the kings of the north, the cities of the plain rebel against them. And so, what happens? Abraham and Lot depart ways, or depart from there. Both of them are living in their respective spots. Chedorlaomer decides what he's going to do is he's going to come down to the cities of the plain. He's going to attack them. And he attacks them successfully, and guess what? He makes off with a whole lot of the wealth from down there, and he takes captive a whole lot of the people. Guess who he takes captive? He takes captive Lot and his family. Who's going to be the hero of the story? He's going to be the one that goes after him. Abraham goes after Lot there in Genesis 14, verses 14 to 16. And he attacks Chedorlaomer and those kings of the north. And Abraham comes back down, and I know that you've talked about this, I think, already in your class. He comes back down to a place called Salem, where he meets a king by the name of Melchizedek. Name translate, King of Righteousness. And he pays tithes of everything that he's received, all of the spoils of war he pays tithes to. And Melchizedek is a character that's only mentioned here, one other place in the Old Testament, and then extensively beginning in Hebrews chapter 6. But here's Abram that has now saved his nephew from these kings and brought back a whole lot of different things. We're not done talking about Lot, but that's generally the events of Genesis chapter 14. All right? And so we're now looking in the next several chapters of the way that goes. As Lot escapes from Sodom and Gomorrah there in Genesis 19, he has 2 daughters that escape with him. What happened to Lot's wife? She looked back at the destruction of Sodom and she turned into a pillar of salt. Lot's 2 daughters, I believe were affected by the culture that they were around. They said, we're the only ones left. Here's what we can do. Let's get Dad some alcohol, and let's each, on different nights, go in and have a sexual relationship with him so that we can have children by our father. Again, you got the idea that you spend time enough with a godless society and allow those values and cultures to affect who you are, and don't stand up for what's right. I mean, something like that can definitely happen. And then we find that Abram moves to Gerar after Isaac is born. So if you want to, let's see. I used too many slides here. Abram is going to move from Hebron over here down to Gerar, which is north of where you see Beersheba. I don't think we got a dot for it, but that's where we'll. Interestingly enough, the same kind of thing happens as it happened in Egypt. That the king of Gerar, Abram says, Sarah, say you're my wife. Say you're my sister again. And the same thing happens. What happens in this is, again, God has to protect his promise. And as he does so, God takes care of everything with regard to Abram and the promise that he made. Okay? From the time when he's there in Gerar, let me fast forward here in my lesson. We're running out of time rapidly. Genesis 21, Genesis 22. Genesis 21, Genesis 22. Genesis 21 is where he has his son, Isaac. Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord said for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abram a son in his old age, and the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Consider this just for a minute. All of these moves that we've been talking about up until this time have happened within what period? What span? 25 years. We caught up to him in Genesis 12 when he was 75. Now, as Phil mentioned, don't know if these journeys took years to accomplish, but now here at the age of 100, he is now holding the future promise in his hands. And the child's name is Isaac. What does Isaac mean? Laughter. Laughter. Why did they name him Laughter? Sarah laughed. Abraham laughed. But who had the last laugh? It was God, right? God had the last laugh. And now, while most people are drawing from their Social Security and retirement, here's this elderly couple that's now got this child that they're taking care of, right? They're changing diapers in the middle of the night, that kind of thing. And I got to imagine that Abraham and Sarah just laughed at that every time they had to get up to take care of a crying baby. But all of these journeys right here took within 25 years. Again, a journey of, can we call it an even 2,000 miles? I don't know. Something like that. It's insane to think about, but here it is. Yes, sir. I thought she was 99. I could be, was she? Okay. All right. Jeannie confirms it. It was 1 year. Yeah. Yeah, let me look at that, Phil. I'll bring that back next week. But either that or, that'd be a good Bible study to do. Find out what the age difference was. Okay. Abraham, here at the age of 100, has this child. What does God command him to do there in Genesis 22? Abraham, here am I. I want you to take your only son. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. How many children did Abraham have at this time? We kind of skipped over this other part, but how many did he have? He had 2. What was the name of the other one? Ishmael. And who was he born to? Hagar, Abraham's servant. Back in Genesis 16, Sarai said, it's never going to happen. Abraham, why don't you take my handmaid? And Abraham goes into her, has a child. Next thing you know, Sarah's jealous, and Sarah's treating her harshly. But here's Ishmael, and God promises Hagar that he's going to take care of Ishmael. He said, he's going to be a great nation on his own. And even today, we deal with, the offspring of Ishmael. Yes, sir. All right. So Google says that Sarah, what's that? Chat says it too. ChatGPT says it too. All right. Can we get Gronk? Anybody got Gronk? No. Genesis 17:17. Thank you. I appreciate the Bible reference. So there's hope for humanity. Yes. All right. Abraham now in Genesis 22 is now taking his son, and what does God tell him to do? Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountains of which I shall tell you. Moriah, we are coming down here from Gerar, and we're going to go up, presumably, again to the place where Salem is. And we'll give you some indication about why that is in just a minute. Here he is. Abraham comes, and his child is old enough to walk. His child is old enough to carry. Child is old enough to understand the nature of worship. Dad, we got the wood, we got the fire. Where's the burnt offering? Where's the sacrifice? Isaac, can you imagine a child, maybe up to a late teenager, being bound? Isaac being laid on the altar. Isaac seeing his dad take that knife and hold it up ready to slay his son. The Hebrew and then the Greek word in the New Testament, particularly in Hebrews 11, I believe, means that he was prepared to slaughter him. In his mind, Abraham, it was already a done deal. And the angel stops him, says, Abraham, now I know that you fear God. Here is the high water mark. Here's the thing that the Jews understood about Abraham, that he believed God, he feared God, and Abraham lifted his eyes there in verse 13 and looked. Behind him there was a ram caught in a thicket by its horn. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered up for a son, or an offering instead of his son. Altar number 5, an altar of provision. What does he call the place? What does he call the place? All right, the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. As it said to this day, in the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. Later on, that same place is going to be referred to as Mount Moriah, where it seems like David is going to build a temple. Let me rephrase. David is going to plan to build a temple, and his son Solomon is going to come a little later and build the temple. And ultimately, in the mountains of Moriah, God is going to sacrifice his son in the very same place that Abraham was willing to offer his son. Isn't that interesting? Again, a lot of things to consider, a lot of biblical interest and biblical connections that we can make here. Questions, thoughts? Notably here, Genesis 22, look at verses 15 through 18. This is a promise. Again, you're following the promise trackers, promise assurances. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I'll bless you. Multiplying, I'll multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, as the sands of the sea, which is on the shore. And their descendants shall possess the gates of your enemies. In your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Abraham knew that God was going to provide, and here's the angel Lord giving God's testimony once again. All right. A couple of things about the later years. We find that Sarah is going to die, being 10 years younger than Abraham. And Abraham in Genesis 23, how much of this land does he own? Well, he doesn't own anything yet, but that's exactly right. There in Genesis 23, we read about him gaining the smallest of areas here in this land. He goes to the sons of Heth and says, I don't have any property. I need to bury my wife. And the sons of Heth say, well, choose your place. He said, there's a field, Machpelah, and a cave there with it. And that's where I want to purchase. And one of the men said, well, no, let me just give it to you. Abraham said, no, let me buy it. And so you find this really interesting ancient Israel bargaining / purchase process. That's all there in Genesis chapter 23. Look at the emphasis there at the end, verse 18. To Abraham as a possession and presence of all the sons of Heth before all who went to the gate of the city. After that, Abram buried his wife in the cave of field of Machpelah before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that were in it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth as property. 3 times right here at the very end, we have Abraham now owning purchased property. I meant to put in a picture of what they've got. They've got a big monument, of course, to Abraham and to Sarai and his family called the Tomb of the Patriarchs that you can go and you can visit today. And they've got a well there on the ground that you can go and kind of take a look down into the cave. So, the latter years, we find the death of Sarah. We find the purchase of the cave of Machpelah there in verse chapter 23. One more thing that we want to look at, and we'll make some applications. You know, you've stuck with me pretty well, so hang on just for a minute. There is a wife for Isaac that now needs to happen. Abraham tells his servant, notice verse 2 through 4 of chapter 24. Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had, please put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord and the God of heaven and the God of the earth that you will not take a wife from my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. But you shall go to my country and to my family and take a wife for my son Isaac. Why was Abraham concerned that his son not take a wife from the daughters of the Canaanites? They didn't believe in God. They didn't follow God. And in fact, these people are doomed to destruction because of their wicked ways. And you find that all the way back that God's going to inherit. But what Abraham's doing is he's saying, servant, you go and you find my son a wife. Notice this continuing, verse 5. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman won't be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said, beware that you do not take my son back there. Why did Abraham not want his child to go all the way back to Ur? Why do you think? Because where's the promised land? What happens if Isaac gets all the way some 800 to 1,200 miles away from that and sees the blessing of living in Ur? What happens if family begins to pressure? You know, that's exactly what happened to the servant, that Laban and the brother of Rebekah, who's going to become Isaac's wife, Laban's like, no, just stay a couple more days, stay a couple more days. It's kind of like the idea was that he wanted the servant to hang out there. God says, you don't take my son back there. This is his land. This is the promised land. And that's the idea. A couple lessons for you to fill in your blank. Number 1, God, who is the God who promises, provides better things than what we found. I've got to imagine Abraham going through the Fertile Crescent and seeing some truly beautiful lands, don't you? And I wonder if Abraham ever asked the question that our kids ask from the back seat on our way to Disney World. What is it? Are we there yet? God, isn't this good enough? Isn't this good enough? Isn't this good enough? But God continued to lead him on to better things. I appreciate this one. Movement and activity does not always mean spirituality. It's true for an individual, it's true for a church. That you can have a whole lot of things that are going on, and yet it doesn't necessarily mean that there are spiritual things going on. I appreciate the fact that Abram, from his life, always reoriented himself to God and to all the monuments that God had done in bringing about this journey of faith. Number 3, lesson from Lot. What's good to our eyes is not always good for us. What's good to our eyes is not always good for us. All right, Genesis 3, Adam and Eve looking at the fruit, right? Or Eve looking at the fruit, absolutely. You get this all the way through the Bible. Sometimes there will be people that will say, hey, Andy, I'm going to go and I'm going to move my family out here. Okay, well, what's the church like? Oh, why not? Isn't that something that's important to you? Well, you know, but it's a big upgrade. It's a big opportunity for me. Well, is the church strong? Are they going to be able to be a blessing to you, or are you going to be able to be a blessing to them? I don't know. Well, why not? I mean, sometimes things that seem to be good on the surface we haven't really looked at with eyes of faith. God's going to protect his people who look for a better city. Strangers and pilgrims. Strangers and pilgrims. Hebrews 11 talks about the fact that here's Abraham and Sarah, in the context of Abraham and Sarah, as people who are looking for a city whose builder and maker are God. Abraham followed God in faith. He had never seen this land. He'd never seen the place that God had prepared for his descendants. And yet at the same time, you don't find him faltering by faith at the promises of God. He held fast to the promise even though he wasn't perfect and, yes, was fearful at times. Last one, and I believe from Genesis 24, we ought to be people who rest in the promises of God and beware of leaving them. Abraham didn't want his son Isaac to leave from the land. He wanted him to remain and know that's where the promise is. And Isaac is going to have to grow in his own faith as he does in the next several chapters of Genesis. But overall, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even on into the children of Israel, knew that this is where God's promise lies. This land is promised to us. This blessing is promised to us, that through Abraham's seed, God's going to bless all nations of the earth. Again, a lot of things to think about, and I hope that this has enhanced at least your study of about the first 25 chapters of Genesis, and that you can make some connections whenever, Lord willing, Tom gets there. So, thanks so much for your attention, and we will